In this episode, I'm speaking with David Lee from Soul Satisfying Work, and we're going to discuss how to apply the hero's journey model into your everyday life. I think you'll find this a quite thought-provoking episode. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 309 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for a discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. In this episode, I'm speaking with David Lee from Soul Satisfying Work, and we're going to discuss how to apply the hero's journey model into your everyday life. I think you'll find this a quite thought-provoking episode. David is a colleague of Scott Woodard, who was on the podcast with his wife Camille in episode 305, when they told their story of becoming expats in Mexico. David reached out to me via LinkedIn after that episode had published. David had been a guest on a variety of podcasts lately, and I asked him to pitch me on a podcast idea. His pitch was the following: how to use the hero's journey model as a tool for navigating this chapter and to bring more thoughtfulness and intentionality, wisdom, and fascination to life. I remember David Whyte saying how John Keats said poetry made all of life more interesting. I've found that applying the hero's journey to everyday life makes everyday life more fascinating, as well as how we view our journey as an earthling. We did not have a plan on how the discussion would go ahead of time. I like to let these discussions flow organically, and I edit them down. It turned out to be one of the most thought-provoking discussions I've had in a long time. The episode lasted close to 50 minutes, which I edited down to a little over 40 minutes. So this episode's a little longer than usual, but I would encourage you to listen to the entire episode. However, before we get to the episode, let's have a word from our sponsor, Career Pivot. The Career Pivot membership community is a group of people from all over the U.S. and Canada with diverse backgrounds. This community where everyone is there to help everyone else out, figure out what they want to do in the second half of life, and then make it happen. Many have made changes that they did not know existed or was possible when they came to the community. They learned from each other and broadened their horizons on what was really possible. Let's hear what Greg had to say about being part of the community.
I joined the community when I was in the midst of a career transition. And what I needed unbiased input and support and observations from folks who'd present me with their point of view that would help me figure out what I'd like to do next. And I didn't want to do it with people who lived around me or past professional colleagues. So that's where Mark and the community have been really instrumental. So I've got a built-in support network who will be genuine, honest, and supportive.
I'm recruiting new members. If you are interested in learning more about the endeavor, please go to careerpivot.com/community. David mentions a lot of books and podcast episodes in this discussion. I will have links to all of them in the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-309. Now, on to my discussion with David Lee. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. I have a real interesting podcast episode for you today. I have David Lee, who happens to be a friend with Scott Woodard, who was on the podcast about 3-4 weeks ago with his wife, Camille. And we're going to talk about the hero's journey and how it applies in everyday life. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Good to see you and good to be on.
Let's get started. What is the hero's journey?
Joseph Campbell, a mythologist, at least as far as I know, he's the one who coined the term, where he looked at myths throughout time across cultures. And he noticed that there was a common theme, which he ended up calling a monomyth and the hero's journey. And before I describe the sort of the structure of the journey, if listeners can think of like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Braveheart, Seabiscuit, those are all examples of the hero's journey or a version of the hero's journey. And I'll say a little bit what I mean by version. And so the standard hero's journey is the hero is sort of like a regular, unassuming person living their life in their village or their city, and nothing particularly remarkable. And then they hear, as Joseph Campbell would describe it, is they get the call. They get that still small voice of, you need to go out into the big world, beyond your borders. And oftentimes in hero's journey stories, the hero or soon-to-be hero ignores the call. No thanks, I want to live my predictable small life. And so the call ratchets up. And it's sort of like the alarm clock on your phone, or back in the day before phones, I had this travel alarm that started out like really quietly. And if you ignored it, it would be just like lots of decibels. And so the decibel level, if you will, of the call increases to where the hero can't ignore it. So maybe they get a life-threatening illness or a family member is taken from them, whatever it is. And then in the hero's journey model, the hero crosses the threshold from their safe, predictable life into the great unknown. So Homer's Iliad would be another like classic example. And then in the great unknown, here comes the adventure. And so along the way of the adventure, there's obviously lots of trials and tribulations. There are also guides and helpers who are oftentimes disguised as monsters and bad people, And then also, as part of the hero's journey, there are clues that are hidden in plain sight, if you will, which is, we'll talk about later, what makes it so interesting, I think, to apply it. And so with all the trials and tribulations and challenges, the hero learns so much, becomes a much bigger, better, wiser version of themselves. And then they return to their village, their city, wherever they were, with so much to give others that they didn't have before if they hadn't gone out into that great unknown. So that's sort of the standard hero's journey. Just to throw a little monkey wrench into the model, it's really fascinating to me. I'm a big fan of Dr. Angus Fletcher and his work. He wrote an amazing book called Wonderworks, which is like looking at storytelling as a human technology for helping humans learn how to deal with being a human in this big, scary world. And so he actually says how Joseph Campbell based his theory of a monomyth on a Scottish, I can't remember what profession he was in, who conducted, according to Angus Fletcher's opinion, really shoddy research, and that there really isn't such thing as a single version of hero's journey. And so for me, that's kind of irrelevant, because the general process we've all seen and read many times. So so just to throw that little extra for any folks who know about Angus Fletcher's work and like, hey, wait a minute, you sure about this hero's journey thing?
How does this apply to those of us in the second half of life? How do we use this?
That's started to fascinate me, I don't know, about 15 or more years ago. Let's say it was 15 or 20 years ago when I first like read about the hero's journey. I thought, wow, this is really cool. But it's like, okay, we're not living, times of Zeus or Homer and the Odyssey and all that sort of stuff. And so I started thinking about like, how do you apply this in a practical way? And so here are some of the ways that I've used it, and I think can be really useful. One of maybe the simplest ways of using it is if you were to think of yourself to just like use it as a thought experiment. Say, okay, if I'm a hero in a hero's journey or heroine in a heroine's journey, and what's my journey about? It's like, what am I here to learn? Why, like the various challenges, trials, and tribulations, like what have they been here to teach me? Number one. And then also thinking about what are my gifts that I'm here to bring? So each here, the hero isn't irrelevant or superfluous, that there's a reason for their existence. So like, what is that? And as I know, with the work that you do, that sense of connecting with deeper meaning and purpose in life is even more on people's minds in the second half of life. And so that's one of the ways I think of it's really useful. I also sort of connecting it with that bigger picture thinking. I'm an absolute fan of James Hillman's book, The Soul's Code. Did you ever read that by any chance?
No, I haven't.
Man, is it good. It's not a light read. It's not a summertime beach book for sure. But it's worth wading through. So James Hillman was a Jungian psychologist. He's passed away now. In his writing of The Soul's Code, he talks about how psychology is too small of a model to look at our lives and how our lives unfold. And taking a more mythic view is much more useful and a much bigger, more grander perspective. And just one simple way, and this actually relates to the hero's journey, one simple way that I really love, because one of my careers was as a trauma therapist. And so a lot of like the mental models in that field is like, look at your childhood traumas and how they wound you and how they affect you the rest of your life, with the model that James Hillman talks about. And it's based on, I think it's Plato's Republic and then ancient Greek philosophy, where he talks about, instead of looking at childhood wounds as the root of our dysfunction or pathology or whatever, it's looking at patterns and themes in childhood as the acorn that unfolds and grows into an oak. It's like, what are those patterns? Yeah. Let me stop for a second. Anything that you want to say about that comes to mind?
I mean, I'm 66 now. I still find that, particularly since I've left the US, I have a lot of things come up because of childhood stuff. And you'd think that by the time I'm 66, I'd be over that stuff. But I'm not. So what forms us comes from all kinds of stuff, both environmental, genetic, and the key piece I find when I was interested in you telling, I've had someone else go through with me the hero's journey model. And the idea is I have to understand who I am. One of the things I'm known to say is one of the most important things is know thyself. And when someone says, well, I'm really self-aware, I usually go, no, you're not. Because to really get there is really hard.
Yeah, it's a lifelong process for sure. Yeah, so number one is looking at our life path from that bigger lens. So asking, what is this? Looking at the various especially like inflection points or painful chapters for the like, okay, what's the lesson? And I'm not going to be able to quote this even close to perfection, but I think Jung said, so Carl Jung said something like, if we don't embrace our shadow, we're destined to live it, or it's destined to show up as our destiny, something like that. So back to know thyself. So number one, it's a great tool for reflecting on, okay, what lessons am I here to learn? What gifts am I here to give, to bring? It's also in a more day-to-day sort of dimension. What I've found is it's a great way to have perspective when we're going through a drama. And so there have been times where I'm like, give me a break. Why is this happening to me? I'm not happy or whatever, but then when I think like, wait a minute, you're on. And as I mentioned to you before we started recording, I typically think in terms of the mythic journey versus hero's journey. The reason why I think in those terms is it makes it more clear the connection with our everyday life with that more mystical, numinous, unseen world of the mythic realm. And it also sometimes, as a person reflects on, okay, what are the lessons I'm here to learn? Maybe the lessons are not to be a hero. Maybe they've been gutting it out and grinding it out for so many years, and they haven't been gentle with themselves. They haven't taken time to do the self-reflection or the self-care. So maybe it's being like the anti-hero is really what their journey is. So that's why I like to use mythic journey. And so back to my point about the day-to-day application is, if I'm going through a hard time and feeling sad, sorry for myself and whining and complaining to myself, it's like, hey, wait a minute. This is part of your mythic journey. Like, both suck it up. This is part of what you're here to learn, but also it brings me to another really super useful application of the hero's journey, which is back to when we were talking about the hero's journey model, is how the hero, in order to survive in the great unknown and all the things that are coming at them, they have to be really mindful, really present. One of the other ways why I love using this model in everyday life, it makes me think of, I heard the poet David Whyte say that Keats, famous British poet, say that poetry made everything in life fascinating. And I think of the hero's journey being similar, because if you sort of like adopt the mindset of, okay, I'm on my hero's journey, my mythic journey, and there's clues, then you're much less likely to sleepwalk through life or be on autopilot because you don't know what a clue might be. So let me give you a great example that I just heard in a conversation that I had. I was talking with Suzanne Evans, who also has a podcast called Change Stories, and Susan Nee Chaudhrain. It's a Gaelic name, so I'm still working on pronouncing it. So Irish consultant and also podcaster. And we all love stories. And so I can't remember how this came up, but Susan mentioned how when she was talking with a friend about her next chapter, and she was saying something about, like, I want to, even if it's a small ripple, I want to make a difference in other people's lives. And her friend challenged her and said, like, maybe you need to think bigger, not just think small ripple. And Susan's like, okay, I don't know. And so she's sort of mulling that over. And she goes for a walk, and she walks by where a group of boats are moored at a dock. And she looks at one of the boats, and the boat's name was Make a Splash. Isn't that awesome? Yeah. And she's like, okay, thank you. I got it. And so looking for clues, and, somebody can say, well, you're just, creating meaning. Like you just make that up. It's like, we're all doing that. I know, as you know, we're all making meaning. That's part of the human psychological makeup, is we have to make meaning, or else the world would be just never-ending chaos and unpredictable. Let me stop for a second. I'm curious, have you had any experiences where you were like asking for a clue, a sign, or anything, and it popped in, or yeah, anything you want to share?
In my career in industry disruption talk, I talk about the fact that my life has been filled by disruption, both disruption that I'm causing and has been caused to me. I'll use the example. I've written many times about, I had a near fatal bicycle accident 20 years ago, and therefore I had all kinds of things that were just shoved in my face. And I look at all those as being signs of, why am I doing things? Why am I doing this? I'll use the example when we started thinking about, I read the book Necessary Endings by Dr. Henry Cloud. And Dr. Cloud talks about the fact that in order for new things to begin, you have to end the old things need to end. And by the way, we suck at ending things. And one of my questions was, I'd lived in Austin for 40 years. Why am I still here? My job didn't require me to be there. No family there. My wife and son had moved off to the East Coast. Why am I here? And I couldn't come up with a good answer. And it's interesting when you talk about signs. My wife and I are polar opposites. I'm living in a world where Spanish is the given language, and I read everything. I'm always I read a sign and I'm trying to figure out what does it say? And to me, it's my natural curiosity. My wife doesn't have that kind of curiosity. So I'm always seeing stuff and going, what does that tell me?
I love it. I love it. Yeah, I definitely resonate with that curiosity. And again, I think that's one of the quality of life values of playing with hero's journey model in everyday life, or mythic journey, is that it brings fascination and stimulates curiosity. And it can take a simple experience, and I'll share an example in a second, that's kind of like, oh God, eye roll worthy, or like, what a big dummy I am, and turn it into something that's a real source of wisdom. So I'll give you an example. It is actually kind of fun because you have an audience that I can actually mention Kodak to, like, with a lot of the younger audiences. They're like, what? And so back in, what was that, late 90s, I had a gig at Kodak. And so, this is back in the day when you had to have the suit and all that, and might have been even 3-piece suit time. I can't remember. Anyway, so I fly out to Rochester, and I was so proud of myself. I'm not particularly organized, and I was so proud of myself that, I don't know, like a week or so before my flight, I created my own little self-contained garment bag that I was going to put in my bigger bag, which had my navy blue suit, my white shirt, my red tie, the uniform. Well, when I get to my hotel in Rochester, I realized that I took the wrong garment bag, and all I had, at least I had the navy blue part, but it's just a blazer, but I didn't have any tie, and I just had khakis. And I'm like, I can't, and I was teaching customer service, and we're going to talk about first impressions. I'm like, I can't go there without a tie. I'm not going to buy a whole new suit, but at least I got to buy a tie. So it was at that point when I realized it was about 8:00 at night. You know what it's like traveling. You just want to hunker down. You don't want to go out and shop for anything, but it's like, I got to get a tie. So I get in my rental car. And again, this is Rochester. I'm kind of on the outskirts of town. Fortunately, there was a mall, but it's closing within an hour. I get there, I go to one store, and I wasn't like keeping my eye on the ball. It's just, I was like, instead of like, just get a tie and be done with it, I was like, I had to get a tie I liked. you know, and so like none of them, I liked. And so I have one more, it was a small mall. I have one more store that had a men's department and the clock's ticking. And so now let's say it's 20 of 9. And so I go into the store, go to the men's section, and I see all the ties and they're like in the glass cases and everything. I finally see a paisley tie that I like. Okay, I'm going to get my tie. And I look around, it's a ghost town and there's no help. I'm like, come on. And I'm getting more and more frustrated. And again, I'm thinking like, I just want to be in my hotel. Why did I get this wrong bag? Now there's no help. And I'm just going on and getting just really annoyed by the whole thing. And the tie's there, but I can't get it. Okay. Because it's behind glass. And so finally I see this lady come out from behind the break room, and she looked like, maybe she was like in her 50s, and maybe she was like a school teacher during the day and making a little extra money. And so she comes over and she's like really friendly, like, oh, hi, can I help you? And my inside voice is like, yeah, you could have been here 10 minutes earlier. But I'm like, oh, yeah, sure. And then I go, yeah, I'd like to get that tie, but it's behind glass. And she goes, oh, I know it looks that way. It's kind of like an optical illusion. It really isn't. And she reaches in and she takes it. It was there the whole time, ready for me to take it. And I found myself thinking later, isn't that like life? Like there are opportunities that are there for us, but we think they're not available. And maybe we're waiting for somebody else to make it happen. But it's like, we can make it happen. And so that's like a simple example of, I could have just thought like, oh, what an idiot, I am. And yet again, that experience happened over 20 years ago. And I still think about it, like, remember that and that lesson.
When I worked for IBM, the one time I was going up to meet with a division VP and I forgot a tie. Another time I was heading up and I didn't have shoes. I had sneakers on. And in both cases, I just went and bought shoes and I went and bought a tie. And what I learned to do was when I would travel and I was going to do something like you were doing, where I had to be dressed up, I always made sure and wore all the accessories I needed for the next day. The belt, the shoes, the tie. And you're right. Those are lessons that you never forget.
Yes,
I'll use another example. I was flying to Atlanta and I was going to talk to a Linux users group in the evening. And the account manager asked me, well, could you come earlier in the day and speak to a bunch of Coca-Cola executives at 1:00? So I got an 8:00 flight, flew to Dallas. And at that point, it was obvious that I wasn't going to make the flight to Atlanta because the weather was so bad. And I was all frantic. I was, they're going to be mad at me because I didn't leave early enough. And so I finally called him up, got on a payphone, called him, said, I'm going to make it for there tonight, but I'm not going to make it for the Coca-Cola execs. And his response was, okay.
I love it.
I made all the stories up in my head that he was going to be angry with me.
I love it.
I have something I call MSU disorder. MSU stands for make stuff up. I made stuff up.
You got it. I love it. And I just want to say something about that's such a great example of why I'm such a fan of storytelling.
Yeah.
Is that story, that simple little 2-minute story. I'm sure you've shared that with people over the years, and people A, relate to it, and B, will never forget it.
Yes.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, okay. Like what all this drama I was creating? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So we learn about ourselves, and then how do we how do we build these stories?
Yeah, can you say a little more when you say, how do we build these stories?
Well, I should say, how do we take these everyday learnings and put it into the hero's journey model?
Yeah. So there are two components to it, at least that I think of. One is again, being present for clues. And so I'll give you a personal example that just happened, and then another sort of generic type of example. A couple of nights ago, I woke up in the middle of the night and I started doing sort of like internal doom scrolling, and by nature, I'm not an anxious person, but I got myself into that state. When I got up the next morning, the impact of that I found myself sort of obsessing about this thing that I was worried about. And I typically work out in the morning. And so I was working out and I decided to put on a video like inspiring speeches, something like that, like to get out of this funk. And it was so perfect because the first person in the first video I watched was this gentleman named Joe Dispenza talking about the whole phenomenon of how our thoughts attract, like attracts like. And so if we constantly focusing on what we don't want to happen, we bring that into our life. If we focus on it's an abundant world full of gratitude, how can I be of service? Then that resonates out into the quantum field, blah, blah, blah. And so I'm like, thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. I'm back on track again. And so like, that's just like a simple little example. Another example that I find like incredibly fascinating and useful, and I'd be curious as I share this with you, if you have an example, is how often I've experienced like I'm wrestling with something and I'll either talk with a friend or I'll be watching an educational video or whatever. And it's like the universe speaks through that person. And it's like, thank you. Just what I needed to hear. It's so cool.
It's like anything else. It's just being present. I mean, I just went through an experience. I had to take a Mexican driver's test to get my driver's license down here. And number one, you had to take a 10-question exam. Fortunately, it was in English. The second was they've just starting January 1st here in the state of Jalisco, you actually have to do a parallel parking test.
Oh, no.
And my wife and I just bought a new car, which has a Subaru Forester. It has a zillion cameras. And I was pretty convinced on first try I wasn't going to pass. I was okay with that. And sure enough and my wife, she's super focused. And she was doing better in practice than I was. But instead, I get out there on the course. I just pull in. First time I backed in, I screwed it up. I pulled back out. You get 2 tries. The second one, I just said, I'm just going to go for it. And boom, I nailed it.
Awesome.
Right? Because I'm not worrying about it. And my wife was so focused that she touched the back cone and she failed. She has to go back next week and do it. But it was, I let the universe just kind of take care of it.
Awesome.
So it's allowing, it's like anything else. It still comes to just simply being present. I love of just looking for the clues that are meant to be there. And like I wrote in my newsletter last week, here I was a bit concerned about doing the parallel parking. So we went out and drove out to where they were doing it so I could see the course. And I was hoping to see someone parallel park, but it made me feel better that I saw it and not making it up. Well, this is what it's going to look like.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I always talk about the fact that anytime you're walking into a new situation, you have expectations. those expectations are almost always wrong. Like I said, if I went out and saw it, I knew what to expect. It's kind of like if you're going to go in for an interview.
I was just going to say that. Yes.
Go talk to some people to find out, how do we do this? Can you go to the location beforehand? Can you at least go see the building?
I love it.
Do you know how to drive there?
That's awesome. And it's another great example of using a common everyday story to make a point. So you did the recon, you got a sense of what it was, and so you went in feeling more comfortable.
Yes.
So the being mindful, being present is one of the big applications. Look for clues. And again, it just makes it more interesting, life more interesting. It brings artistry and creativity, more artistry and creativity to life. And then I mentioned about extracting life lessons and wisdom from everyday life experiences. Was a great example of that. Another really useful application of the hero's journey is, so back to in the classic hero's journey, there are oftentimes monsters, and trolls and, et cetera. And then sometimes, surprise, they turn out to be your greatest helper. And so it's a fun mindset to use with the difficult people in our lives. Those annoying life forms that get under our skin are really difficult people. It's like, okay, what are they here to, what's Susie here to teach me? What's Joe here to teach me? And maybe it's just to be more patient. Maybe it's to be braver, to speak up, whatever it is. Like, what are they here to teach me? And so it's just another way of, back to the stories we tell ourselves, the meaning we make, taking something that we can easily go down a negative path or downward spiral of getting angry and resentful, and bringing back to your curiosity point, bringing that curiosity to a different understanding of their role in your life.
Curiosity is so important if you're making changes like I discussed with people. I've had Diane Wingert on the podcast several times talking about mindsets and the growth versus fixed mindset. Do I look at a problem as something that I get to solve, or do I see it as an irritation?
Yes, and related to that, I'm glad you mentioned that about a problem to be solved. Also, one of the other aspects, well, I've mentioned about it makes life more fascinating. There's that Nietzsche quote of, life isn't a problem to be solved, it's a mystery to be lived. And
I like that.
Isn't that good? Man, I love that. Yeah. And so again, like, I'm on my mythic journey, like, what's going to happen next? So like, let's go back to the 55 and plus second, act, second half of life, folks, is, let's say the person has walked away from or limped away from a profession that they were very successful at. They made a lot of money, maybe, have high status. It's like, I just can't do this anymore. And that sense of feeling bereft and empty, and I've lost my identity. And playing with the hero's journey model helps bring that curiosity and that courage to, like, all right, bring it on. Like, I'm part of a long lineage of heroes and heroines. Let's do this. And I think, speaking personally as somebody who loves stories, and as a kid was just captivated by, like, Jack London's books and all those, and even as an adult, I find those especially the reluctant hero stories, like, say, Braveheart or Gladiator, to be so inspiring. And so one of the sort of practical things I recommend to people is watching movies that speak to you of people overcoming adversity, and reminding yourself, we're all part of the family of man, woman, and this is in our blood. Like we've got this, we can do this. And as I'm saying that, I'm saying it very much to myself too. I'm not saying like, oh yeah, I'm always about that because I draw on that a lot. I think maybe the other piece that I want to mention in terms of the using it with second half of life piece is back to the James Hillman when he talks about looking at your childhood as the acorn that had like all the information about the oak in it, and it grew into this oak. And I'm sure you do this with your clients, is like looking at like, what did you love doing as a kid? Yeah. When were you so enchanted and captivated? And what's that telling you?
I actually tell people to look back at the things that you did as a kid that you couldn't get enough of.
Yeah.
And that usually identifies your true talents.
Yes.
Not your skills. And so, for example, as a child, I loved jigsaw puzzles.
Oh, wow.
I didn't do them very frequently.
Uh-huh.
But then if I look at that and what it is, it's pattern matching. Well, I spent my career in technology in pattern matching in all kinds of different ways.
Oh, cool.
In communications protocols, in so many different ways that I'm suddenly going, oh, I get it. And as I like to say, I'm 66. I had my first real job when I was 21, my first technology job. So I've been working for 45 years. I like to say there's a lot of big data there.
That's great. Yeah.
Right.
You got it. And back to the know thyself, doing the work. And as you know, given the business that we're in, is it really helps to do that exploration with somebody who's not you, so they could see. And I love this say, the saying about we can't see the forest for the trees. I remember somebody saying, sometimes our nose is on the bark and we can't even see the tree. That's a great way of looking at it. I'd love to, can I end with a story?
Sure.
Yeah, because it's one of my favorite stories, and it speaks to being present and like, what can this tell me? And it's also a great metaphor for how the hero's journey can help us during difficult times. It's a story that I love telling if I'm doing a program on resilience. And so when I'm teaching resilience, I use it as a story to illustrate the importance of tuning your brain to notice opportunity in the midst of crisis, because as you know, the human brain's designed to hyper focus on the negative versus the positive and the possibility. So what happened was, it was a hot September day in Maine, and I was walking as fast as I could down this country road, and I had a knee injury, so I couldn't run, but I wanted to get some cardio going. So I'm huffing and puffing and going super fast. And all of a sudden, though, I notice on the road, there's all these, so again, it's a hot September day, there's all these little caterpillars that the brown ones with the black band that we called woolly bears growing up. And so like every 5 or 10 feet, there would be like a little woolly bear basking on the warm pavement. But it's a road, so it's going to be a short, time in the sun for them. So I don't want them to get smushed, but I want to get some cardio. So I don't want to stop every like 5 or 10 feet, like pick them up and put them off on the side. So I'm like, is there any way we can make this a win-win? They get to live, I get my cardio. I'm like, okay, I know what. So I take off my tank top and I start walking down the road. And my tank top, I'm whooshing back and forth like a big woolly bear windshield wiper. And so I'm just whooshing them off the road, off, into the dirt or the weeds. And later on, I thought, again, because I always have that like mythic journey. What are the lessons here? I thought, isn't this interesting that the difference that perspective makes. It's like from the woolly bear's perspective, like life is good and then suddenly it isn't, and they're feeling picked on. But from my higher perspective, I get it that I'm saving their lives. And I thought, we're just like the woolly bear. We get laid off, we get fired, something really bad else happens, and we're feeling picked on and by life and besieged. And if we could just get out of that drama and take that bigger perspective, and it's like, what's the gift here? What's the opportunity? And again, I think that's where the hero's journey, the mythic journey, it allows us to do that. So we kind of break free of the woolly bear mindset and are able to see the bigger picture.
Well, David, this has been great. If someone wanted to reach out and contact you, how might they do that?
Yeah, so the two easiest ways is soulsatisfyingwork.com. And then there are a million David Lees on LinkedIn. But if you do David Lee and then Maine, USA, you should find me.
Well, we will put your direct link to your LinkedIn profile and your website in the show notes.
Awesome.
David, thank you very much for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
Thank you. This is a blast.
I hope that discussion got you thinking, as that was the idea. Make sure and check out the links to the books and podcast episodes mentioned in the podcast in the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-309. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com and sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. If you sign up, you'll get my latest white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You'll also find me at Twitter at Career Pivot, although I am not tweeting. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-309. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. I hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.